My name is Rachel Morgan. I am 42 now, but my story begins decades earlier in a small town in Wisconsin. Back then, life seemed steady, almost ordinary, until the night my little sister arrived too soon, and everything in our home shifted. From that moment, the spotlight never left her. I became the quiet one, the strong one, the daughter who supposedly didn't need attention. What they called independence felt more like being invisible. I grew up learning to swallow disappointment, to build strength in silence, and to dream in secret. Over the years, I carved out a life of my own, one brick at a time, fueled not by applause, but by the absence of it. I thought success would finally change how my family saw me. I believed love and recognition might come when I had proven myself. But on one New Year's Day, all the years of sacrifice and silence came crashing together in a way I could never have predicted. What would you do if the people meant to love you most suddenly revealed what they truly saw you as? Stay with me, because the answer will stun you. Let me take you back to where it began. The winter air in Lakefield, Wisconsin, had a way of cutting straight through your skin, sharp and unrelenting even when you were tucked inside the house. I was 8 years old the night everything changed. Until then, my world had been simple. My dad, David, was a physics teacher at the high school, the kind of man who smelled faintly of chalk and coffee. My mom, Carol, worked nights at the county hospital as a nurse, her shoes always squeaking on the kitchen floor when she came home just before sunrise. We were not wealthy, but we were steady. Saturdays meant Dad taking me down to the frozen lake to fish through the ice, and summer nights meant the three of us sitting on the porch with bowls of vanilla ice cream, listening to cicadas hum in the dark. That January night, headlights swept across the living room wall, breaking the calm. Urgent knocks rattled the front door, and before I could blink, Aunt Margaret was inside, her face pale, her breath clouding in the freezing air. She told me to grab a coat to get a few things quickly. My mom was at the hospital, she said. There was a baby, born too early. I didn't understand fully, but the tone in her voice made my small body tremble. I pulled on my boots while Dad paced, trying to listen to Margaret and also grab his own coat. She hustled me out the door, her hand tight around mine. The night felt darker than usual, the snow crunching under our steps. When we got to the hospital, I could hear the steady beeps and rushing footsteps before we even entered Mom's floor. I peeked through a glass window and saw her, pale and exhausted, hovering over a clear box filled with wires and tubes. Inside lay a tiny baby, her skin-flushed red chest rising and falling with effort. They named her Lindsay, my little sister. She was too fragile for anyone to touch, not even me. Every time I leaned close, Mom pulled me back, whispering that germs could kill her. Even after she came home months later, it was like our house had turned into a lab. Hand sanitizer bottles stood in every corner, air purifiers hummed through the night, the smell of bleach seeped into my sheets. Whenever I coughed or sneezed, I was sent off to Grandma Helen's for days at a time. At first, going to Grandma's felt like a treat. She baked apple pies that left the whole kitchen smelling warm, and she always had a new book waiting for me on the nightstand. But slowly it sank in. I was not being spoiled. I was being sent away. One afternoon, not long after Lindsay came home, I came back from school with my first perfect score on a math test. I ran into the kitchen, the paper clutched in my hand, proud in a way only a child can be. Mom barely glanced at it before turning to Dad to remind him to buy tissues because Lindsay had a runny nose. Dad smiled faintly and muttered, "Good job," then went back to peeling an orange for the baby. The paper slipped in my hand like it had lost all weight. I tried other things. I drew pictures and taped them to the fridge, only to find them later shoved under a stack of Lindsay's pediatric charts. I won first place at the science fair, and when I told Mom, she nodded absently and whispered to the baby to go back to sleep. Every effort I made was swallowed whole by the needs of my sister. "Gabriella, please be quiet," became a sentence I heard more than my own name. Over time, I learned how to fade into the background. My room became my refuge. The peppermint oil Mom used to keep Lindsay away lingered on the walls, sharp but comforting, because it meant I could finally breathe without someone telling me to hush. I stacked books on my little desk, diving into worlds of art, antiques, and history, anything that made me feel like I was part of something bigger. But what cut deepest was when my parents began rewriting my silence as strength. At church gatherings, I overheard Mom telling neighbors, "Rachel has always been independent. She understands Lindsay needs more care." No, I didn't understand. I only knew the hugs, the praise, even the soft smiles had disappeared. Dad told an old colleague once that Rachel is the type who takes care of herself so we don't have to worry. I wanted to scream that taking care of yourself does not mean you don't need love. The house grew quieter around me, but the noise in my heart only grew louder. One evening, I brought another paper home, a drawing of the lake at sunset, colors swirling across the page. Dad barely looked before turning the TV up to drown out Lindsay's crying. Mom walked past me with a bottle of formula, eyes fixed on the baby. I stood there in the hallway, the paper trembling in my hand, and I realized it didn't matter what I did. In their eyes, Lindsay was the center, and I was a shadow pressed against the wall. I remember sitting on the porch that night, cold air biting my face, listening to the wind whip across the frozen lake. For the first time, I felt the kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being invisible. That was the winter I understood. I had lost something I would never get back. A family that once felt whole had slipped through my fingers, and no matter how tightly I tried to hold on, nothing was ever the same again. And yet, sitting there with my knees pulled to my chest, I also felt the smallest spark. A quiet thought, whispering that if no one else would see me, maybe one day, I would find a way to make myself impossible to ignore. By the time I reached middle school, it felt like I had already been living in the margins for years. Every morning, the house revolved around Lindsay. If she coughed, Mom measured her temperature twice. If she had a spelling quiz, Dad drilled her with flashcards as if the future of the family depended on it. I packed my own lunch, brushed my own hair, and walked myself to the bus stop without anyone noticing whether I was running late or not. I remember one Saturday morning when I carried home a ribbon from a local art contest. I had painted the church steeple, reflecting on the frozen lake, using watercolors I bought with babysitting money. I walked into the living room, hoping for a small reaction. Mom was on the couch with Lindsay curled against her chest. She looked at the ribbon, smiled politely, then whispered to my sister that she was her precious miracle. Dad reached for the remote and turned the volume up to cover Lindsay's whimper. My ribbon slid onto the coffee table and was buried under bills by evening. People outside the house believed a different story. Mom would tell neighbors Rachel has always been strong, she understands Lindsay needs more attention. Dad would nod, adding she is the independent one. They made my silence sound like virtue when in truth it was the only option I had. The contrast between home and Grandma Helen's house was like stepping into a different world. Grandma lived a few blocks away, in a small yellow cottage, with ivy climbing the porch rail. She always smelled of flower and lavender. Every time Mom sent me there, Grandma pulled out her mixing bowl and let me measure sugar for pies. She asked me about school and actually listened to my answers. When I showed her drawings, she framed one and hung it in the hallway. It was the only place where my work ever stayed on the wall. Aunt Margaret gave me another refuge. Her bakery, Sweet Pines, sat on Main Street with windows fogged from ovens that never seemed to rest. I was only 13 when I begged her to let me help after school. She looked at me carefully, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "If you work hard, you deserve a place in the world." That single line lodged in me deeper than any praise I ever heard at home. I tied my hair back, washed trays, and wiped tables until my arms ached. The smell of cinnamon rolls clung to my clothes long after closing. One evening, I came home smelling of sugar and yeast. Mom wrinkled her nose and told me not to hold Lindsay until I washed twice. Dad asked if the bakery was even paying me. When I told him not yet, that I was learning, he shook his head as though I had wasted my time. But I felt something different. For the first time, my effort was noticed by someone, even if it wasn't my parents. School became another battlefield for attention. I tried out for the debate team, joined choir, signed up for science fair projects. Each certificate went into a drawer because there was no point leaving them on the fridge. Lindsay's Sunday school drawings always took that spot. Once she drew a crooked flower with bright crayons, and Mom pinned it with magnets and called it proof of her creative gift. My first place ribbon in biology sat folded in my desk. I started spending more and more hours away, hiding in the corners of the public library, where I could lose myself in books about art history and antiques. Old jewelry fascinated me not because it was shiny, but because it carried secrets. A tarnished brooch could be priceless if you knew where to look. I felt kinship with those overlooked objects. They reminded me of myself, hidden and unvalued, but holding something rare inside. The more invisible I became at home, the more I built an inner life no one could touch. I carried a notebook everywhere, sketching the outlines of rings and pendants I saw in old catalogs. Grandma noticed one afternoon and brought out a small wooden box from her dresser. Inside were pieces she had inherited, most worn and ordinary. But there was a silver hairpin with pale lavender stones that glimmered in the sunday. She let me hold it carefully, and I remember the weight in my hand, heavier than it looked. She said, "Sometimes people miss what is truly valuable because they never look close enough." That sentence echoed in my mind whenever I felt the sting of being ignored. At school events, when parents filled the gym with flowers and balloons, mine rarely showed up. If Lindsay had a choir performance, the whole family went. When I stood on stage receiving a certificate for academic excellence, the seat reserved for families stayed empty. I pretended not to notice, smiling for the camera of a teacher who snapped a picture out of pity. There were nights when I lay awake listening to the hum of the air purifier in the hallway, the bleach smell drifting under my door. Mom's voice would carry down the hall as she told Dad how tired she was, how demanding Lindsay's care had become. Dad would murmur his agreement. My name was never mentioned. I pressed my face into the pillow, whispering silently that I was still here. The turning point came the summer before high school. I brought home my report card with straight A's, the kind kids taped proudly to the fridge. Mom skimmed it quickly, then asked if I could keep an eye on Lindsay while she made dinner. Dad congratulated me with a distracted pat on the shoulder. That night, as I sat on the porch steps watching fireflies glow in the yard, I realized that nothing I did would ever tilt their attention back to me. Still, I kept trying. Part of me believed if I could just be remarkable enough, they would finally see me. Another part of me, the deeper one, started whispering a different plan. If they refused to notice, then maybe one day I would create a life so undeniable that they would have no choice but to reckon with who I had become. Grandma's words about hidden value circled in my mind like a quiet promise. I did not yet know how, but I clung to the idea that being overlooked now did not mean being worthless forever. And so I carried on quietly, working shifts at the bakery, stacking books from the library in my room, sketching jewels in the margins of my notebooks, and learning to survive in the silence. By the time I turned 15, I had learned to take care of nearly everything on my own. I woke up before dawn to finish homework, slipped into the bakery after school, and came home late smelling of sugar and soap. My parents never asked where I had been. As long as I did not disturb Lindsay's sleep schedule, I was free to move like a ghost through their house. What they did not know was that every hour I worked, every coin I tucked away was part of a bigger plan. College had become my private rebellion. I refused to wait for permission or money that would never come. I spent evenings in the library, poring over scholarship databases, scribbling down deadlines, and practicing essay drafts. The other kids complained about their parents nagging them to study. I wished for even a fraction of that pressure. One spring afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table, filling out forms when Mom glanced over my shoulder. She asked what I was doing. I said I was applying for financial aid. She frowned and told me not to expect help from them, that every spare dollar needed to go toward Lindsay's future. I nodded and folded the papers back into my folder. Inside, my chest burned, but my face stayed calm. At the bakery, Aunt Margaret noticed me scribbling between wiping tables. She leaned over and asked if I wanted her to read my essay. I hesitated. She was the first adult to even offer. That night, I handed her a draft about growing up invisible in my own home. She corrected grammar, circled words, but kept most of it intact. She told me it was honest and strong, and that truth carried weight. Grandma Helen was no less of a supporter. One evening, I sat in her kitchen while she kneaded dough, and I confessed that I felt like no matter what I did, my parents would never care. She wiped her hands and told me, "Sometimes life is not about changing the people who cannot see you. It is about building yourself so bright that they cannot ignore you forever." Her voice was steady and her eyes did not waver. I carried those words like armor. By senior year of high school, I had applied to 12 universities. I did not tell Mom or Dad. I did not want the eye rolls or the reminders that Lindsay needed new ballet shoes. I gathered teacher recommendations, walked to the post office myself, and paid for stamps with tip money. I saved coins in a glass jar labeled bus fare because one scholarship interview required me to travel across the state. The night before that interview, I ironed a borrowed blouse in Grandma's spare room. She sat on the bed watching me fumble with the sleeves and reminded me that nerves only meant I cared. The next morning, she pressed a small tin of cookies into my hand and whispered that no matter what happened, I was already more determined than anyone she knew. Weeks later, I was wiping down the bakery counter when my phone buzzed with an email notification. My breath caught when I saw the words "Congratulations" and Northwestern University. I had been accepted with a full ride. My knees went weak. Aunt Margaret rushed over, and when I told her, she wrapped me in a hug so tight it broke something open inside me. For the first time, I cried because someone was proud of me. I carried the acceptance letter home that night. I laid it on the kitchen table, waiting for Mom to notice. She skimmed it, muttered congratulations, and quickly asked Dad if he remembered to pick up cough syrup for Lindsay. Dad nodded and said good job without looking away from the evening news. I folded the letter quietly and slipped it back into my pocket. Upstairs, I heard Lindsay giggling with a friend on the phone about a new boutique jacket. The following week, the whole family threw a party for Lindsay because she had won second place in a local art contest. Balloons floated in the living room. Dad hung her drawing of a pink cat on the wall with a shiny plaque, and relatives came by with flowers. I stood in the corner sipping soda, thinking of my scholarship letter folded in a drawer. That night, I lay awake and admitted to myself that no matter how high I climbed, they would never climb with me. When graduation day arrived, the gym filled with families cheering. I walked across the stage alone. No camera flashes from my row, no flowers, waiting in the bleachers. Grandma clapped from the back, her small figure barely visible, but her presence steadied me. After the ceremony, she hugged me and whispered that she wished my parents had seen what she saw. I smiled faintly and told her maybe one day they would. That summer, I worked double shifts at the bakery, saving every penny. The smell of bread and sugar followed me home each night as I counted bills and coins on my bedspread. I bought a used suitcase at a thrift shop and folded my few good clothes inside. While other kids took family trips before college, I worked until my feet ached and my eyes blurred. The morning I left for Chicago, Dad loaded Lindsay into the car to take her to a piano lesson. Mom gave me a stiff hug at the door and told me to stay safe. No tears, no long goodbye. I hauled my suitcase down the porch steps, pausing only when Grandma pressed a note into my hand. It read, "You are stronger than they will ever admit." I tucked it into my wallet and boarded the bus. As the town slipped away through the window, I felt both heavy and light. I was leaving behind the silence that had shaped me, but I carried within me the fire it had lit. I promised myself that in Chicago I would not be invisible. I would build a life that could not be ignored, even if the people who should have cared the most never chose to see it. Chicago greeted me with noise and grit, the kind that clung to your clothes no matter how many times you washed them. I moved into a small dorm room at Northwestern with walls thin enough to hear my neighbor's alarm clock. The city felt like another universe compared to Lakefield. For the first time, no one knew me as Lindsay's sister, or the girl who could take care of herself. I was simply Rachel, and that blank slate terrified me as much as it thrilled me. Classes in art history quickly became the heartbeat of my life. The first time I walked into a lecture hall lined with slides of Renaissance paintings, my chest tightened with wonder. While other students yawned, I leaned forward, scribbling notes, memorizing names, tracing patterns and margins. I was hungry to learn, hungry in a way that came from years of being starved for attention. In my second year, I applied for an unpaid internship at a small jewelry appraisal firm downtown. The office was tucked above a dusty antique shop, its windows smeared with years of neglect. Most students my age were chasing internships at finance companies or tech startups, but the moment I stepped into that cramped office, something in me sparked. The air smelled faintly of old wood and metal polish. I knew I belonged. The senior appraiser, Evelyn Cooper, had sharp eyes and a voice that cut through pretense. She slid a tray of pieces in front of me and asked what I saw. I fumbled at first, naming obvious details, until she leaned closer and said quietly, "That value lives in the smallest marks." From then on, I studied everything under the magnifying glass, as if my life depended on it. The hours were long and the pay non-existent, but I never cared. I pulled on cotton gloves, bent over trays, until my back ached, and took the bus home long after dark. I lived on instant noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, but every time I identified a faint engraving or a hidden clasp, I felt richer than anyone else I knew. One afternoon, Evelyn placed a brooch in front of me, dismissing it as costume jewelry worth maybe a few dollars. The piece seemed ordinary at first glance, yet something about the weight made me pause. The enamel was too fine, the engraving too delicate. On the back, nearly worn away, was a tiny maker's mark. I spent the entire night researching, cross-referencing museum archives with borrowed logins from the library. My hands shook when I discovered it belonged to a French artisan who had once crafted pieces for nobility before his workshop was destroyed in the war. The next morning, I presented my findings to Evelyn with every document and photograph I had gathered. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. At last she nodded and told me to prepare a full report. Weeks later, that same brooch sold at an auction for $40,000. For the first time in my life, my name appeared in the company's email. It was a single line that read, "Rachel Morgan has a sharp eye." I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. That one sentence meant more to me than years of empty praise at home. I threw myself deeper into the work, combing through collections others dismissed as junk. A cloisonné necklace marked as a reproduction turned out to be an original from a Russian artist. A wedding band labeled generic was actually a limited commission for a wealthy Boston family in the 19th century. Each time I presented my case with trembling hands and a pounding heart, and each time Evelyn's eyes grew sharper with approval. During lunch one day, she asked if I had ever considered going on my own. I laughed, pointing at the stale sandwich in my hand, and told her I could barely afford groceries. She tilted her head and replied that hunger often makes the sharpest hunters. I carried those words back to my tiny apartment, repeating them until they sank into my bones. Meanwhile, letters from home trickled in, always focused on Lindsay. She had switched her major again from art to marketing and needed more money for supplies. Dad asked if I could come home for her recital. Mom mentioned that tuition bills were piling up. None of them asked about my classes or the work I was doing downtown. I did not argue anymore. I folded the letters, slid them into a drawer, and returned to the magnifying glass. But a part of me still ached each time I saw their handwriting. My third year ended with me graduating with honors, though my parents did not make the trip. Grandma Helen sent flowers that arrived wilted from the long delivery, but I pressed them in a book so I would never forget. Aunt Margaret mailed me a card with $20 tucked inside and a note that said she always knew I was destined for something bigger. As I packed my dorm room, I stared at the few belongings I had. A handful of books, a cracked desk lamp, and a box of notes scribbled with maker's marks and sketches of gemstones. It did not look like much, yet it was everything. That summer, I stayed in Chicago to continue working at the appraisal firm. My friends scattered across the country chasing careers with big salaries and sleek offices, while I sat in a dim room cataloging scratches on rings. But I knew I was building something, even if I could not yet name it. One evening, I walked home under the flickering streetlights, clutching the small wooden notebook Grandma had given me years earlier. On the first page, she had written in her shaky hand, "It is not the rare item, it is the person who sees it as treasure." I pressed the book to my chest, the city buzzing around me, and for the first time in my life I believed that sentence could be true about me. The decision to open my own business did not come in a single lightning bolt. It crept in, slowly building on late nights in that cramped office, on the growing stack of reports with my name at the bottom, on the constant whisper in my head that maybe Evelyn had been right. Hunger makes the sharpest hunters. By the time I was 27, the whisper had become too loud to ignore. I signed a lease for a tiny office on the third floor of a worn building in Milwaukee. It sat above an Italian cafe that smelled of garlic and espresso, and next to a dentist's office that had long since shut down. The space was barely 300 square feet, with a wobbly wooden desk I found on the curb, a mismatched chair, and a lamp that flickered whenever I switched it on. Still, when I hung a small sign in the window that read Heritage and Iris Appraisals, I felt something rise in me I had never felt before: pride. The first months were brutal. My phone stayed silent more often than it rang. I left business cards at pawnshops, antique stores, even estate lawyers' offices, hoping someone would take a chance on me. When work came, it was small. An elderly woman wanting to know if her engagement ring was genuine, a family wondering if the pearls in their jewelry box were worth more than costume value. I charged far less than the big firms, but I checked every detail with care. One evening, I sat at my desk with bills spread out before me, wondering how long I could keep the lights on. My phone buzzed with a call from a local attorney handling an estate. He needed someone to verify a set of old rings found in a safe. I agreed immediately. I stayed up that night researching similar collections, my notebook filled with sketches and cross-references. When I delivered the appraisal, the attorney shook my hand and told me I had saved his client from selling pieces at scrap value. That handshake felt like a small crack of light. Word began to spread slowly. One satisfied client turned into 2, then 3. A local antique dealer started sending me every questionable piece he came across. I spent long hours bent over my magnifier, cataloging scratches, tracing hallmarks, comparing settings. I ate peanut butter crackers for dinner, the hum of the cafe downstairs a comfort as I worked into the night. 6 months in, I landed my first substantial job. A law firm representing a wealthy family brought me a collection that had been sitting untouched for decades. Among the pieces was a ruby pendant dismissed as reproduction. My hands trembled as I studied it. The cut was unusual, the craftsmanship impeccable. After weeks of research and sleepless nights, I presented my report. The pendant was an authentic piece from the late 19th century, valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars. When the family later confirmed the sale, I received a check larger than any I had ever held in my life. I remember staring at the numbers, my breath shallow. It was enough to cover rent for months, enough to hire help if I dared. That night, instead of collapsing into bed, I walked to the lakefront. The air was cool, the water dark, and I stood there whispering to myself that maybe I had finally stepped into the life I had dreamed of. I hired Maya, a recent geology graduate with bright eyes and steady hands. She learned quickly, and for the first time, the office hummed with 2 voices instead of 1. We ate cheap pizza on the floor between stacks of boxes, laughing at how glamorous our so-called empire looked. Growth came faster than I expected. Within 2 years, I had opened a second office in Minneapolis. By the 5th year, a third in Denver. We were still small compared to national firms, but our reputation for detail and integrity brought clients from both coasts. Museums called. Auction houses reached out. Collectors with locked safes trusted us with pieces they had hidden for decades. One afternoon, as I signed off on an appraisal contract worth nearly $500,000, I paused to think about the journey. From the girl left out of family portraits to the woman running 3 offices across states, my net worth had climbed past $12 million. Yet I still lived in a modest house, drove a silver SUV, and carried an old phone. Not because I could not buy more, but because I no longer needed to prove myself through glitter. At night, though, when the offices were quiet and the city lights flickered outside, I thought of my family. They still assumed I worked a temporary job somewhere, tinkering with antiques. On Sunday dinners, they asked casually if I had thought about teaching or applying for a job with benefits. I sipped my water, smiled faintly, and said the work kept me busy. They never pressed for details. Lindsay, meanwhile, had cycled through another degree program. This time, it was interior design at Parsons, the very dream I once tucked away because we could not afford it. Mom called one evening, her voice weary, saying tuition was more than they could handle on Dad's pension. Could I help just for a little while? I stared at the contract in front of me worth $400,000 and thought of the years I had survived on noodles. I told her yes and began transferring $3,000 each month. Over time, the requests grew. 5, then 7. Each time I told myself it was not because they deserved it, but because I could. Yet deep inside, a question simmered. How long could I keep giving without being seen? One night, long after Maya had gone home, I sat in the office with the lamp flickering above me. I opened Grandma Helen's old notebook, tracing the words on the first page. It is not the rare item. It is the person who sees it as treasure. I closed the book and leaned back, the city quiet outside, and wondered how much longer I could live unseen by the very people who should have known my worth first. Lindsay's world looked nothing like mine. While I was hunched over magnifiers and research books, she floated through semesters at Parsons in New York, with designer bags slung over her arm. My parents loved to brag about how she was finally finding her passion, how she had a natural eye for style. Each time the tuition bill arrived, Mom's voice on the phone grew more pleading and Dad's tone more weary. I wired the money without complaint, even as the numbers climbed higher than I ever imagined I would give. I scrolled through social media one night, something I rarely did, and there she was. Lindsay, smiling in front of a brand new BMW, the caption reading, "Rewarding myself after a tough semester. Hard work always pays off." My jaw tightened. I knew exactly where that money had come from. I paid her reward while I ate leftovers in my office and worked until my eyes blurred. At Sunday dinner a week later, she tossed her keys on the table like they were props. Mom clapped her hands, beaming, telling everyone how proud she was of Lindsay for managing so much on her own. Dad nodded, mentioning that it showed real maturity. I sat there with my plate, chewing slowly, and swallowed back words that burned at the edge of my tongue. It became a pattern. Lindsay posted vacations in Miami, new outfits, dinner at rooftop restaurants, while my parents called me with more requests. "Your father's pension is stretched," Rachel, Mom would say softly. "Lindsay has finals coming up and we just want her to focus. Can you help us a little longer?" I knew little longer meant forever. Still, I sent the money. Each transfer labeled family support tuition assistance. I told myself it was easier than arguing, easier than explaining where the funds truly came from. They never asked how I afforded it, never wondered if my work had value. They simply assumed I could and I should. The contrast between us grew sharper every year. Lindsay had never held a job, never bagged groceries or cleaned tables. Her textbooks lay scattered across the house while I carried stacks of reports back and forth from the office. She spent summers at internships that looked more like vacations, all unpaid, but decorated with glamorous photos. Meanwhile, I stayed in Milwaukee, expanding quietly, opening doors in Denver, negotiating contracts that stretched into millions. During one family gathering, Mom leaned toward me while pouring iced tea and said, "It is so generous of you to help your sister. You know she will give back to the family when she succeeds." I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. She said it as if my success did not exist, as if I was simply a placeholder until Lindsay bloomed. One night after dinner, I lingered to help Dad stack chairs. He looked older than I remembered, his hair thinning, his shoulders bent. He sighed and said he worried about Lindsay, that he just wanted her to have every chance. I asked quietly if he ever worried about me. He looked startled, then patted my shoulder and told me I was strong, I would always land on my feet. The words should have been comforting, but instead they hollowed me out. The more I gave, the more invisible I became. It was as if my parents had convinced themselves that I lived cheaply, eating canned soup, riding the bus, hoarding pennies. They never pictured the reality of who I had become, the woman negotiating with museums and international collectors, the woman who built something from nothing. They preferred the illusion that their struggling daughter scraped by so she could funnel money into her sister's dreams. I returned home one evening to find Maya waiting at my office desk. She pointed at the transfer receipts stacked neatly in a folder and asked why I did it. I shrugged, telling her family was complicated. She shook her head, younger but sharper than I gave her credit for, and said, "One day they will have to see you for what you are." I smiled faintly, but inside I doubted it. The weight of silence grew heavier. I worked longer. Hours, signed bigger contracts, expanded quietly, while my family celebrated every small milestone Lindsay reached. When she earned a certificate for a design project, they threw a party with balloons and a cake. When I secured a multi-million-dollar appraisal contract, I ordered takeout in my office and ate alone under fluorescent light. It was not the lack of recognition that cut deepest. It was the rewriting of truth. Mom telling neighbors that Lindsay was the talented one, while Rachel preferred to live simply. Dad assuring family friends that I had no ambition, that I was content tinkering with antiques. These stories spread and I let them. Correcting them would mean pulling back the curtain, and I was not ready. The turning point came on a summer afternoon when Mom called with a new request. Tuition had gone up again, and Lindsay needed more supplies. I asked how much. She said, $7,000 a month, just until graduation. My hand froze on the pen I was holding. I realized then that graduation was a moving target, one that might never arrive. That night I sat alone in my office, staring at the transfer confirmation on the screen. The cafe downstairs had closed and the silence was thick. For the first time, the thought of stopping entered my mind. It startled me the way a locked door might suddenly swing open on its own. I was the one keeping this going. Without me, the illusion of Lindsay's independence would collapse. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the computer washing over the room, and let the truth settle like a stone in my chest. My family had built their comfort on my back, and they did not even know who I had become. The question was no longer how much I could give, but how much longer I was willing to live unseen. It was during one of those Sunday dinners when I caught the words that confirmed what I had suspected all along. I was helping Dad carry a tray of dishes back to the kitchen when I heard Mom's voice in the dining room. She was leaning close to Lindsay, telling her not to worry about the rent in New York. "Your sister will cover it. She always does." I froze in the hallway, my hands gripping the tray so tightly I thought it might crack. There it was, spoken like an unshakable truth. My role was no longer daughter, I was the safety net. Lindsay giggled and said she knew I would never let her down. The casual way she said it, as if my sacrifices were as dependable as sunrise, made my stomach twist. I set the tray down on the counter and stared out the window at the yard. The trees were bare, their branches rattling in the wind like bones. I wanted to march back into the room and shout, but the weight of years of silence pressed against my chest. I carried the emptiness home with me, heavier than the dishes I had hauled. At the office, life was no lighter. A competitor in New York named Jonathan Reed had started spreading whispers about me in industry circles. He ran a slick firm with glossy brochures and catered to wealthy clients who wanted prestige as much as accuracy. Word reached me that he claimed my company inflated values to lure clients that I was more hobbyist than professional. I laughed it off in front of Maya, but when I was alone, it stung. I had built everything carefully, brick by brick, detail by detail, and now someone was kicking at the foundation. One afternoon, I attended a regional appraisal conference in Chicago. As I walked into the banquet hall, I noticed Reed standing near the podium, his smile practiced and cold. He shook hands with collectors and museum curators, as if he owned the room. When our eyes met, he nodded slightly, a gesture that felt more like a dare than a greeting. During his presentation, he spoke of integrity in appraisal, emphasizing the dangers of amateurs misrepresenting value. Though he never said my name, I felt every word land like a stone. I sat stiff in my chair, scribbling notes I did not need. My pulse hammered in my ears. Afterward, a few colleagues approached me quietly, assuring me they knew my work spoke for itself. But I could see doubt flickering in some eyes. Doubt was a dangerous thing in this business. When I got back to Milwaukee that evening, I stayed in the office long after Maya left. I reopened reports, double-checked data, combed through every photograph and record, as if I were preparing for a trial. I would not let him tear down what I had built. Still, the timing was cruel. At home, my family drained me, and in the professional world, my credibility was under attack. It felt like I was trapped between two walls closing in. One night, exhausted, I called Grandma Helen. She listened quietly as I spilled everything from Mom's words at dinner to Reed's whispers in Chicago. When I finally stopped, she said, in her steady way, "Rachel, people will always try to take from you when they see you have something they cannot build themselves. The trick is knowing when to fight and when to let silence be the proof." Her words eased the tightness in my chest, but silence at home was no longer proof of anything. My parents' expectations had shifted from unspoken to blatant. They no longer asked if I could help. They told me what needed to be covered: Lindsay's apartment deposit, her design software, a new laptop after she spilled coffee on the last one. Dad even mentioned casually that maybe I could help with a down payment when Lindsay was ready to buy her first place. I nodded through phone calls, my voice calm, but inside a storm brewed. Every time I wired money, I pictured Lindsay tossing her hair back, laughing in restaurants I had never been invited to. Every time my parents praised her for working so hard, I heard the unspoken dismissal of me. Maya noticed the change in me. She found me one morning staring blankly at an emerald ring under the magnifier. She asked if I was all right. I forced a smile and told her I was tired. She did not press, but I caught the worry in her eyes. One evening, while reviewing a client's estate collection, I got an alert on my phone. Lindsay had posted a video of herself unboxing designer furniture in her apartment, thanking her parents for their endless support. My jaw tightened. Endless support. I was invisible again, erased from the story. The days blurred together, the pressure mounting from both directions. At home, I was the wallet. At work, I was the target of a man determined to discredit me. I began waking in the middle of the night, my heart racing, questions pounding in my head. How long could I keep feeding a family that saw me only as a bank account? How long could I stand silent while someone chipped away at the reputation I had poured my soul into? That Sunday, I skipped dinner. I told my parents I was busy with a client. Instead, I sat at my desk with the city quiet outside and my grandmother's notebook open in front of me. Her words stared back at me, steady as stone. "It is the person who sees the treasure." I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. I knew a breaking point was coming. The walls were closing in, but I was not the same girl who had once been pushed aside. I had built something too strong to collapse in silence, and in my gut I felt it. The moment was drawing near when everything would finally be forced into the open. New Year's Day arrived with a biting wind that swept across Lakefield and rattled the porch railings of my parents' house. I had agreed almost against my better judgment to host the holiday dinner. Mom said she was too tired, Dad. said no one else could manage it, and everyone looked at me the way they always did, expecting me to fix things. Instead of cooking, I hired a catering team from Chicago that specialized in private events. They arrived in black vans with trays of polished silver and linens crisp enough to make our old dining room look like something from a magazine. Lindsay walked in just as the team was setting crystal glasses on the table. She gave a low whistle and muttered under her breath that I was trying too hard to impress someone. Mom hushed her quickly, but the words clung to me like smoke. I stayed quiet, helping the staff lay out platters of roasted lamb and trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres, pretending I didn't hear. By 5 o'clock, the house was full of relatives. Coats were piled on the sofa, children ran in and out of the kitchen, and laughter spilled down the hallway. I poured wine into glasses, making small talk, while my mind ticked away at the thought of an upcoming auction I needed to monitor later that night. I had promised myself I wouldn't mix work with family, but some contracts couldn't wait. Dinner was served on time, the food gleaming under the chandelier. Compliments filled the air as people marveled at the quality, asking where I learned to cook like that. I smiled and let them assume. For once, I didn't mind the misunderstanding. I just wanted one peaceful meal, free of comparisons, free of the shadow of Lindsay. Halfway through dessert, I slipped upstairs with my laptop. A client in Tokyo was bidding on a rare Meiji-era gemstone set, and I needed to be on call in case verification questions came up. I balanced the laptop on my old desk headset in place, my eyes glued to the stream of numbers rising on the auction screen. For a few minutes, I forgot the noise downstairs. The door opened without a knock. Lindsay leaned against the frame, chewing a piece of pie, her eyes narrowing at the glow of the laptop. "Do you have a charger? Mine's dead," she said already, stepping inside. She looked at the screen before I could close it, her eyebrows arching. "What is all this?" I told her it was work, nothing important for her to worry about. But she moved closer, her gaze sharpening on the tabs open along the edge. She saw the account balance before I could shift the window. Her lips parted, then curled into a smirk. Without asking, she snatched the laptop from the desk. My pulse hammered as I stood telling her to give it back. She ignored me, carrying it like a trophy as she marched down the stairs into the dining room. Her voice rang out over the clatter of dishes. "Everyone, you're not going to believe this." The room quieted. Forks paused midair. She spun the laptop around the screen, glowing bright. "Look at this," she said, her voice high with excitement. $10 million. My sister has $10 million and never told anyone. For a long moment, silence choked the room. I saw my father's face go pale, my mother's mouth open and close without sound. A cousin leaned forward to squint at the numbers, and an uncle muttered something under his breath. The only sound was the faint clink of a spoon hitting porcelain. Mom broke the silence with a laugh that didn't sound like laughter at all. She said I must be helping someone with paperwork, that it couldn't possibly be mine. Her voice wavered as if even she didn't believe it. I stepped into the center of the room, every eye on me. My hands were steady, though my chest burned. "No," I said, "it's mine. I built Heritage and Iris from the ground up. We operate 3 offices across 3 states, and those contracts you see on that screen are mine to sign." The words hung heavy, echoing off the walls of the house I had once been invisible in. Lindsay's smirk faltered. Dad shifted in his chair, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Mom's fork slipped and clattered against her plate. The silence that followed was thicker than any I had ever known. Someone finally coughed. My aunt asked weakly why I had kept it a secret. I did not answer. My father leaned back, folding his arms, his eyes darting between me and the laptop. My mother forced a thin smile, but her voice cracked as she said, "Well, if that's true, then we should talk about what this means for family." I watched her carefully, her words cutting through the air like a blade. That was the moment I realized peace had been a fantasy. They were not stunned with pride. They were calculating. And I knew the night was far from over. Dad was the first to speak after that tense pause, his voice low but edged with something I had never heard before. He said it was impressive that he had always known I was capable, but his smile never reached his eyes. Mom followed quickly, clapping her hands lightly against the table and saying how proud she was of me, how remarkable it was to see I had built something real. For a brief moment, I wanted to believe them. I wanted to think maybe this was the turning point, the moment they finally saw me. But the compliments melted faster than snow on a warm sidewalk. Mom leaned forward, her eyes sharp now. She said that since I had all this success, it was only right I help Lindsay set up her future. Lindsay had talent, she said, but talent needed support. Dad nodded, adding that if I funded a small design firm for her, she could finally stand on her own. I sat still, my fork resting untouched beside a piece of pie. My chest tightened as their words grew bolder. It was not a request. It was an expectation spoken as if it were the natural order of things. My millions were not mine at all. They were for the family, for Lindsay. Lindsay wiped her eyes like she had been holding back tears, though she had been smirking minutes earlier. She said it hurt that I had kept secrets, that she felt betrayed. Then she looked at me, her voice trembling, and told me I owed it to her. She had dreams too, and what kind of sister would I be if I let money stand in the way? I glanced around the table. Relatives avoided my eyes, fiddling with napkins and glasses, some nodding along with Mom's reasoning. No one spoke up for me. I was outnumbered, my own family treating me like a vault that had finally been cracked open. The heat in my chest rose to my throat. I took a sip of water, holding the glass steady, and asked calmly if they remembered who had been sending money every month for years. Mom blinked, confused. Dad frowned. Lindsay froze, her hands tightening on her napkin. I told them I had been wiring thousands, quietly covering tuition rent bills, all without a word of thanks. For the first time that evening, silence fell again. My aunt's fork clinked against her plate. Mom's face drained of color. Dad shifted in his chair. Lindsay stammered that she thought the money came from them, that I had just chipped in here and there. I shook my head. It was me. It had always been me. A cousin muttered under his breath about how generous I had been, but no one else said a thing. The truth settled over the table like a heavy fog. For years they had painted me as the one who did nothing while I had been propping up their golden daughter's life. Lindsay's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they looked different. She said she still deserved help, that family meant sharing everything. Mom found her voice then sharp and cutting. She said if I truly loved them, I would not hesitate. Dad slammed his hand against the table, telling me this was not the time for selfishness. My hands trembled in my lap, but I kept my voice steady. I told them I was done. No more transfers, no more quiet sacrifices. If Lindsay wanted to build a business, she would have to do it herself. The room erupted. Mom cried out that I could not do this to them, that they had counted on me. Dad's face turned red as he accused me of abandoning the family. Lindsay shouted that I was ruining her life, that she had trusted me. Their words blurred together, rising in pitch, a storm crashing down on me. I pushed back my chair, the sound sharp against the floor. The chatter faltered for a second. I stood and looked at each of them, my heart pounding. I told them plainly that if the only reason they wanted me around was for money, then I was finished buying love. No one moved to stop me as I walked to the door. Behind me, I heard someone whisper about lawyers, someone else mutter that I would regret this. But I kept walking, my steps steady, even as my chest ached. I opened the door to the cold night air, letting it hit my face like a splash of water. When I slid into my car and gripped the steering wheel, my hands were still shaking. The house behind me buzzed with voices, the windows glowing with light. For the first time in my life, I left without looking back. The drive back to Milwaukee that night felt longer than it should have. Snow clung to the edges of the highway, my headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the dark. My phone buzzed again and again in the cup holder, but I refused to look. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the screen was lit with dozens of missed calls and texts. I set it face down on the counter and let the silence of my house wrap around me like a blanket. The next morning, the first knock came before 8. Aunt Karen stood on my porch with a plate of leftover pie, her face carefully neutral. She said the family was confused, that maybe things had gotten out of hand. She told me Mom was upset and Dad felt blindsided. She leaned closer and whispered that Lindsay had cried herself to sleep. I invited her and poured coffee and listened politely. When she finally asked if I would reconsider, I shook my head. I told her everything I had given, everything I had covered without recognition. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked ashamed. Then she said softly that I had done more than enough, but family was family. That old refrain. I walked her to the door and thanked her for coming, but my decision was set. Later that week, Grandma Helen called. She had been quiet during the dinner, her gaze steady on me even as the room erupted. Now she spoke in her gentle tone, telling me she was proud that I had finally spoken the truth. She reminded me that love without respect is not love at all. Her words were the only balm I had. Lindsay was less subtle. She sent messages dripping with accusation. "You ruined everything. You knew I was counting on you." She tagged me in a social media post filled with photos of us from childhood, her caption painting me as someone who had abandoned her. The comments poured in, half of them pitying her, half skeptical of her theatrics. I ignored them, but each picture gnawed at me. She was rewriting our story again, but this time in public. At the office, I tried to focus. Maya noticed the shadows under my eyes and offered to take on extra reports. I thanked her, but I needed the distraction. I buried myself in appraisals, in the steady rhythm of cataloging gems and tracing hallmarks. Still, I could not escape the echoes of that dinner. Every time I signed a contract, I heard Dad's voice accusing me of selfishness. Every time I transferred a file, I saw Mom's tears of disappointment. One afternoon, a longtime client stopped by unexpectedly. He was a lawyer who had trusted me with his family's estate years ago. As we finished reviewing a new collection, he hesitated, then asked if everything was all right. I must have looked surprised, because he added that he had seen Lindsay's post. Heat crept up my neck, but before I could answer, he said he admired my discretion. He knew the truth always surfaced in time. I swallowed hard and nodded, grateful for his quiet support. A week later, word reached me that Lindsay had shown off a Cartier watch to friends, bragging it was a gift from our parents. What she did not know was that one of those friends was also a client of mine, someone who could recognize a fake. When the story came back to me, I could only laugh, not with humor, but with the hollow relief of someone whose mask had finally slipped. I did not confront her. I let her keep pretending. The tension with my parents deepened. Mom called one evening, her voice clipped, and demanded to know if I was really cutting them off. I told her calmly that I had already stopped the transfers. There was a long pause, then she said I was destroying the family. She added that Lindsay's dreams would wither without me. I replied that if her dreams depended solely on my money, then they were never her dreams to begin with. Dad tried a different approach. He sent a long email carefully worded about responsibility and legacy. He said that with my success came duty, and that no matter what I thought, I owed it to the family to share. I read it twice, my stomach tight. Then I closed my laptop without replying. In quiet moments, doubt crept in. I wondered if I had been too harsh, if maybe I should have agreed to one more year, one more tuition bill. But then I remembered Lindsay's smirk as she exposed my account to the whole room, the way my parents' pride dissolved into demands, and the way no one asked how I had managed to climb so high on my own. The doubt faded, replaced by resolve. One night I sat by the window with Grandma's old notebook open on my lap. I traced the words she had written years ago. "It is the person who sees the treasure." I thought about how long I had waited to be seen, how much I had given, how invisible I had allowed myself to remain. No more. The calls slowed after that. The messages became less frequent, though sharper when they came. I felt the shift, the quiet calculation. They were regrouping, deciding on their next move. It was not over. I could feel it. But for the first time, I was not afraid. The snow outside had begun to melt the streets, glistening with slush, when I locked the office late one evening. I stepped into the cold air and felt something strange, a lightness I had never known. It was the weight of years, lifting the chains of silence breaking. For once I did not feel like the forgotten child. I felt like someone who had finally stepped out of the shadow, even if it meant walking alone. A few weeks passed quietly before the storm hit again. I was at the office reviewing an estate collection when Marcus, my attorney, called with a tone I had never heard from him before. He told me that a relative had reached out to inquire about the possibility of forcing me to provide financial support, using words like obligation and family duty. He reassured me there was no legal ground for such claims, but warned that I might see more attempts in the form of harassment or public pressure. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glass case of emerald rings in front of me, and felt a cold wave of both anger and exhaustion. Later that evening, I opened my email and found a flood of messages. Some were from uncles and cousins, carefully worded, but heavy with guilt-tripping. Others were more aggressive, demanding that I reconsider, and reminding me of everything my parents had supposedly sacrificed for me. One message in particular stood out, written by my father's old friend, accusing me of abandoning my roots and becoming selfish. I sat in silence, letting the words sink in. Then I called Marcus again. He suggested sending cease and desist letters to every person who had crossed the line. For the first time, I agreed without hesitation. The next morning, we drafted the notices. I made sure a single sentence was included at the end of each one, not in legal jargon but in plain words. Love, if it exists, should never come with an invoice. I imagined the faces of those reading it, the silence that would follow, and felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Meanwhile, Lindsay doubled down on her campaign. She posted a long caption on social media about betrayal, attaching old photos of us as children, painting me as cold and heartless. The comments were split, some rallying behind her, others questioning why a grown woman needed her sister's money to build a life. I didn't reply, but inside I could feel the burn of injustice. She had taken the very memories that once comforted me and turned them into a weapon. At work, news of the family drama started to leak in subtle ways. A few clients called to check on me, their tone cautious but supportive. One collector even confided that my discretion in the face of public attacks made him trust me more. He said, "When people scream loud, it usually means they have nothing real to show." I smiled faintly and thanked him, holding on to that small affirmation. Grandma Helen was the only family member who reached out with sincerity. She called one afternoon while I was drinking tea by the window. She said she had seen the posts, that the neighbors were talking, but none of it changed how she saw me. Her voice was firm when she told me I had done the right thing. I could hear the clink of her teacup as she reminded me that family is supposed to lift you, not weigh you down until you collapse. I held on to her words like an anchor. The legal letters went out within a week. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. Calls stopped. Messages ceased. Even the social media drama slowed. Marcus said it was a good sign that people realized there would be consequences. Still, I knew, in my gut, that silence did not mean acceptance. It meant retreat, and retreat often precedes another attack. Sure enough, whispers reached me through a client who happened to live near my parents. He told me that Lindsay was telling people I had stolen family wealth, that I was hoarding what should have been shared. The absurdity of it made me laugh out loud in his office, but later, driving home, the laughter faded and left only weariness. It hurt to know that my own sister would rather spread lies than face her own failures. One evening, as I reviewed inventory at the office, Maya noticed I was distracted. She asked gently if I wanted to talk. I hesitated, then told her a little about what was happening. Her eyes widened, and she said she couldn't imagine a family treating someone like that. She added softly that I deserved better, that people like me built something out of nothing, while others only demanded. Her words broke through my armor, and I had to step outside for air, blinking back tears in the cold night. A few days later, Grandma arrived at my door with a small suitcase. She said she wanted to stay with me for a while to give me company and peace. She carried with her a tin of butter cookies she had baked herself. That evening, we sat in my living room, sorting through a small set of antique brooches I had just acquired. Her eyes lighting up with the same spark I remembered from childhood. She told me quietly that I had already chosen the right path, and the rest of the world would either catch up or be left behind. The sense of calm she brought was priceless. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night without waking to the buzz of my phone. I knew the battle wasn't over, but I had fortified myself, legally, emotionally, and in spirit. I was ready for whatever came next, and I understood something I never had before. Sometimes the greatest act of love for yourself is drawing the line no one is allowed to cross. Spring arrived slowly that year, the snow along the lakeshore melting into streams that ran down the streets and left the air smelling faintly of earth and damp pine. My days settled into a rhythm I had never known before. I woke early, made coffee in silence, and walked through my new house without the tension of waiting for a phone to ring. Grandma Helen stayed in the guest room longer than she planned, and I did not ask her to leave. She brought a sense of peace that reminded me I was not entirely alone. Work grew busier as word spread about our firm's success. A museum in New York contacted me about a rare 18th century collection, and a designer in Los Angeles wanted me to authenticate pieces for an upcoming exhibition. I traveled more often, moving through airports with a quiet confidence I had never felt in my younger years. Each trip reminded me that my world had expanded far beyond the narrow walls of my parents' house, beyond the expectations they had tried to trap me in. At night, after long days of appraisals and meetings, I would sit by the window overlooking the lake. The water reflected the last streaks of daylight, and I would think about how far I had come. I remembered the girl who used to sit in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by sanitizer and silence, invisible to the very people who should have loved her. That girl was still inside me, but she was no longer powerless. She had built something no one could take away. The silence from my family continued. Occasionally, a distant cousin would try to reach out, but their words were always laced with caution, as if they were testing the waters. Lindsay posted less frequently, though every so often her bitterness showed through in cryptic messages. I no longer felt the sting of them. Instead, I felt something close to pity. She had all the attention in the world and yet none of the independence that made life real. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, shaky but familiar. It was from my mother. She wrote that she missed me, that she had not understood how deeply her words and actions had cut. She did not ask for money. She only asked if one day I might sit at the same table with her again. I read it twice, then folded it and placed it in a drawer. My heart ached, but I was not ready. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, and wounds do not close just because someone finally notices the blood. Grandma told me gently that reconciliation is a choice, not an obligation. She reminded me that healing sometimes means distance, and distance does not erase love. I held her words close, letting them settle where years of doubt had once lived. The biggest shift came not from family, but from within myself. I stopped hiding. At a conference in Paris, I walked onto the stage and introduced myself by name. No hesitation, no apology. I spoke about the art of seeing value where others overlook it, about the patience it takes to recognize a true gem. The applause at the end was warm, but what mattered most was the calm I felt inside. I was no longer performing to prove anything. I was simply living as who I had always been. Back at home, I placed the lavender stone hairpin that had once belonged to Grandma in a velvet box and set it on the first shelf of my private gallery. It was not the most valuable piece I owned, but it was the most precious. It was a reminder of where I started, of the invisible girl who had grown into someone who finally chose her own light. Life did not become perfect. There were still moments of sadness, memories that caught me off guard, nights when I wondered if I had done the right thing. But there was also freedom, and with freedom came strength. I learned that the family you build for yourself, the people who see you and stand with you, matter more than the family who only saw you as a source of comfort or income. As I sit here now watching the lake shimmer under the early evening sky, I know I made the right choice. I chose dignity over duty, truth over silence, self-respect over approval. And for the first time in my life, that is enough. What about you? Have you ever had to make a choice between keeping the peace and standing up for yourself? Do you believe family loyalty should outweigh self-respect? Or is there a moment when walking away is the only way to survive? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, I invite you to stay with this channel for more powerful stories of justice, betrayal, and the strength it takes to choose your own path.